He was 27 years old the night his life cracked open on a public street. Lorenzo had saved for 3 weeks to book that restaurant. Not a fancy place by anyone else's standard, but it had white tablecloths and a candle on every table, and he had wanted her to feel something. He had wanted to give Bianca the kind of evening that said, "I am building towards something. Trust me." He had ironed his shirt twice. He had rehearsed what he was going to say about his new data architecture contract, how the numbers were finally starting to move in the right direction, how things were going to be different by the end of the year. But Bianca already knew what she was going to say before the bread arrived. She was calm about it. That was the part that stayed with him longest. Not angry, not sad, just calm. The way someone is calm when they have already made peace with a decision and are only showing up to deliver the paperwork. She folded her napkin, she reached into her clutch, and she set a single copper coin on the edge of the table between them. "Consider that my contribution to the dream," she said. Lorenzo looked at the coin. Then he looked at her. "I'm not doing this anymore, Lorenzo." Her voice did not shake. "Broke is a disease, and I refuse to catch it." She stood. She smoothed the front of her dress. And then she walked out of that restaurant, out through the glass door and down the steps, and into the back seat of a car that cost more than everything Lorenzo owned combined. The driver did not hesitate. The car pulled away from the curb like it had somewhere important to be. Lorenzo sat at the table alone with a half-filled glass of water and a copper coin staring back at him. He paid the bill. He did not have enough cash, and he had to do quiet, humiliating mathematics with the waiter about which card to try first. He walked home because he could not afford the ride. It was 40 minutes on foot, and it rained for 20 of them, and he did not put his collar up because he did not care enough to bother. The Castillo house was old in the way that meant it was falling apart slowly and had been for years. The kind of old that shows itself in a sagging porch step, a window that no longer closes flush, paint that has faded to the color of an apology. Lorenzo had grown up in this house. He had convinced himself it was temporary, that he was always one good contract away from something better. Standing on the front step that night with rain in his collar and a copper coin in his fist, he was not sure he believed that anymore. He went inside. He did not turn on a light. He walked to the kitchen and sat down at the table in the dark, and he set the coin in front of him and he stared at it. He was not crying. That was the strange part. There was no chest heaving, no wet face, no sound. Just a man sitting in a dark kitchen staring at a coin like it owed him an explanation. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere in the house, a pipe knocked. The rain kept coming down outside. He did not hear Lucia come in. She moved the way she always moved through that house, quiet and efficient, like she was trying not to disturb the air. She was the family's housekeeper, had been since before Lorenzo's father passed, and she knew every creak in that floor well enough to avoid them all. She was not young, and the years of that kind of work had settled into her hands and her shoulders in the way that honest labor always does. Lorenzo had grown up around her the way you grow up around furniture. She was always there. He rarely thought about why. She came into the kitchen and she saw him sitting in the dark. She did not turn on the light. She did not ask what happened or say she was sorry or fill the silence with anything that did not need to be there. She just walked to the table, and she set something down beside the coin, and then she stepped back. It was an envelope. Old, slightly crumpled at one corner, the kind that had been held and set down and held again many times before it ended up on that table. There was a small stain near the seal, the kind you get when careful hands are not quite steady. Lorenzo looked at it. "Lucia, what is this?" "Open it when I leave," she said. "I am not taking your money." He had not even opened it, but he already knew. He could hear it in her voice, and he did not want it, whatever it was. He did not want one more thing that night that he could not give back. "This is not for your rent," Lucia said. Her voice was even, unhurried, the way it always was. "This is for the person you are when no one is looking." Lorenzo opened his mouth. He had nothing. She did not argue with him. She did not wait for him to find the words. She simply turned and walked back out of the kitchen the same way she had come in, quiet across the old floor, and then she was gone and the house was still again. Lorenzo sat for a long time without moving. Then he picked up the envelope. Inside was money, folded carefully and counted twice by the feel of it. and beneath the bills a single piece of paper. The handwriting was small and neat and slightly uneven, the way writing looks when someone has had to think hard about every word. He read it once. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again. He sat there in the dark kitchen with a copper coin in one hand and an envelope in the other. Two women, the same broken night, and two entirely different things they had chosen to leave behind. The first 3 years were not glamorous. Nobody writes about those years. Nobody puts them in the highlight reel or mentions them in the profile piece. But those years are where the real story lives. Lorenz converted the back room of the Castillo house into a workspace. Two second-hand monitors, a server he had assembled himself from parts he sourced in pieces over 4 months, and a folding table that wobbled unless you wedged a folded piece of cardboard under the left leg. He kept the cardboard there for 2 years. He knew exactly which angle to rest his elbow so the table would not shake. Small things like that become a kind of discipline when you have nothing else. He worked on the idea that had been living in the back of his mind since his years as a data architect. He had watched systems that were built to serve people who already had everything, and he had watched those same systems quietly turn their backs on everyone else. The unbanked, the informal traders, the market women and the small mechanics and the young graduates with brilliant minds and no credit history and no collateral and no way in. He knew that world. He had grown up close enough to the edge of it to feel its draft. L-Vantage began as a document, then a pitch deck, then a prototype that crashed 4 times before it held. Lorenzo made cold calls from a prepaid line, pitching to people who did not call back, following up with people who blocked his number, refining the model every time someone told him it would not work. He slept 4 hours some nights. Some nights he did not sleep at all. He ate whatever was in the house and did not think much about it. He kept the envelope in the top drawer of the wobbling table. He did not spend the money carelessly. Every naira of it was tracked in a notebook, accounted for, stretched as far as careful hands could stretch it. Lucia's money became the first server cost, the first filing fee, the first proof that L-Vantage was a real thing and not just a document on a hard drive. He treated it like it had weight because it did. By the 4th year, a small regional credit union in Lagos agreed to pilot the platform. By the 5th, they had 3 more. Lorenzo hired his first employee, a young developer he found through a university forum who worked for a salary Lorenzo could barely cover, but covered anyway. By the 6th year, L-Vantage had processed enough microloan transactions that the numbers were impossible to ignore. Then came the message that changed the scale of everything. It arrived through a legal intermediary, a Series A investment offer, substantial enough to move L-Vantage from regional player to continental infrastructure. The investor was listed as a holding entity, quiet and clean on paper, no press, no fanfare. Lorenzo assumed it was one of the smaller venture firms circling the African fintech space. He had been in conversations with several. He signed the documents, deployed the capital, and did not think much more about the source. But something stayed with him, a small detail that should not have mattered but did. The wire transfer arrived with an internal reference number, and inside that string of digits was a sequence he recognized. He could not place it at first. Then one night, going through an old box of papers, he found it. A note Lucia had once slipped under his door during the first winter of building, a short note asking if he was eating, with a small amount of extra cash folded inside. The reference number matched a sequence she had written by hand at the bottom of that note, a personal tracking code she used for her savings, the kind of quiet, careful system a woman uses when she has learned not to trust banks with the things that matter most. Lorenzo sat very still for a long time. He started making calls, not to lawyers, not to his board, to people who knew people, to record offices, to anyone who could tell him the trail behind that holding entity. It took 11 days. What he found at the end of those 11 days did not feel like a discovery. It felt like a wall falling down. The holding entity traced back to a small account that had been opened years ago under a name he recognized. A name that had no business appearing in Series A documentation. a name that belonged to a woman who worked in a laundry in a quiet part of the city and had never once asked Lorenzo for anything. He kept pulling the thread. And then the worst part came. A medical record search, a hospital administrator who spoke carefully, a date that lined up with something Lorenzo should have noticed years ago and did not. Lucia's younger brother had been scheduled for heart surgery. The surgery had been postponed. The reason given was financial. By the time the funds became available again, it was too late. The brother had not survived the delay. The date of that postponement was the same month Lorenzo had used her savings to pay for his first server. She had known. She had known the entire time, and she had never said a single word. Not one. No guilt trip, no midnight phone call, no letter asking him to carry it with him. She had handed him the money, and she had stepped back, and she had let him build without the weight of what it had cost her, because she did not want him to lead with guilt. She wanted him to lead with vision. Lorenz stood in the middle of his 43rd floor office, with the Lagos skyline spread out below him and the Forbes Africa issue with his face on the cover sitting on the glass table behind him. And he felt something shift inside his chest that no amount of success had any answer for. He pressed the intercom. His assistant answered immediately. "Need two things," Lorenzo said. His voice was quiet, controlled. The way a man sounds when he is holding something very large very carefully. "Find Lucia Andrade, last known location, current location, all of it, and pull the acquisition file on the Marchetti estate. I want the deed ready to move." He released the intercom. He did not sit down. He stood at the window and looked at the city that Lucia had helped him build, and he understood for the first time what it was he actually owed. The resume was good. Lorenzo's hearing panel said so before he ever entered the room. Bianca Marchetti had rebuilt herself on the surface, and she had done it well. The credentials were sharp. The portfolio showed range. The answers she gave the panel were structured and confident, delivered in the kind of measured tone that comes from practicing in a mirror. She had dressed carefully for the interview, a dark blazer, good shoes, hair pulled back clean. She had presented herself as someone who belonged in a room like that one. She did not know whose room it was. The name above the door read L Vantage Capital. The man everyone inside called Mr. L was known in the press as a private figure, camera shy, someone who let the numbers do the talking. His face was not on the lobby wall. His name was not printed large anywhere in the building. Bianca had done her research on the company. She had not done enough. Lorenzo watched the final minutes of her panel interview through the interior window of the adjacent room. He stood with his hands in his pockets and said nothing. His head of talent looked at him once, waiting for some kind of signal. Lorenzo gave none. He just watched. Then he straightened his jacket and walked through the door. The moment she saw him, Bianca went completely still, not the stillness of composure. The stillness of a person whose body understands something before the mind is ready to accept it. The color did not drain from her face so much as it reorganized itself into something unfamiliar. Her hands, folded neatly on the table, did not move. Lorenz sat down across from her. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward with anger or perform any version of a man taking his moment. He simply sat down the way he sat in every room, like the room already belonged to him because the work had made it so. The silence lasted long enough to matter. Then Lorenzo reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He set something on the mahogany table between them. Small, dull, copper-colored. It made a soft, flat sound when it landed, the kind of sound a thing makes when it has no weight left to pretend. Bianca looked at the coin. She looked up at him. Lorenzo said, "I kept the change." Nothing in his face was cruel. That was the thing she would probably carry longest. There was no satisfaction in his eyes. No performance of power, no smile that wanted her to know it was winning. There was just a man who had arrived at a place called clarity, and clarity does not need to be loud. He opened the folder in front of him. He looked at the numbers the panel had compiled. The metrics were real, and he reviewed them honestly, because that was how he ran every decision in that building. The marketing experience was solid at the mid-level but did not meet the senior threshold his team had defined. The portfolio lacked the continental scale the role required. The numbers said what they said. "You are qualified for a lot of rooms," Lorenzo told her. This one is not the right fit. He closed the folder. He stood. He picked up the coin and put it back in his pocket because it had never been for her. It had never been a trophy or a weapon. It was a reminder and it belonged to him. He left the room without looking back. The laundry facility was 40 minutes outside the city center. It sat at the end of a commercial row between a hardware supplier and a woman who sold fabric by the yard. There was a handwritten sign above the door. The machines inside were loud and the air smelled of warm soap and something close to steam. Lorenz walked in on a Tuesday afternoon wearing no tie, no security visible, just himself. Lucia was folding linens at the back table. She looked up when she heard the door and the recognition moved across her face slowly, the way recognition does when someone has not let themselves hope for something in a long time. She did not rush toward him. She did not pull back either. She just stood there with a folded sheet in her hands and looked at the man in front of her. Lorenz crossed the room. He did not hand her an envelope. He did not produce a check or a phone transfer or anything that money comes in. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and he drew out a folded document, thick with legal language and official seals, and he set it on the table beside her linen stack. "Read the name at the top," he said quietly. Lucia set the sheet down. She picked up the document. Her hands, worn from years of careful work, did not shake. She read the top line. Then she read it again. The pediatric hospital bore her brother's full name. It was already built. It was already staffed. In 3 weeks it would receive its first patients, children from the same communities Elvantage had spent a decade serving, children whose families had nothing except need and love, and the particular resilience of people the system had never prioritized. Lucia stood very still with the document in her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes were full but her voice was steady. "You remembered," she said. Lorenzo held her gaze. "You made sure I would." That evening, Lorenzo stood on the balcony of the Elvantage headquarters as the sun pulled itself below the Lagos skyline. Inside, on his desk behind the glass wall, the copper coin sat in a small frame, not displayed for visitors, not labeled, just there where he could see it every morning when he sat down to work. He thought about what it had taken to get to this balcony. The rain-soaked walk home, the wobbling table, the cold calls, the 11 days of pulling a thread he almost left alone. He thought about what he had once believed success was supposed to look like, and how wrong that picture had been. Bianca had given him the motive to move. Lucia had given him the means to build. And he had spent 10 years learning the difference between those two things, learning it slowly and then all at once, the way every truth that matters tends to arrive. One of those was a hobby. The other was a mission. And the mission had always had a name.